So, I don't think it's a stretch to say that video game characters go through a lot, right? I mean, here, just to pull out one hero's resume from the ether, during the main storyline of this hero's adventure, her experiences included being tied up at the bottom of a lake to drown, the deaths of at least 5 friends, a rather conservative estimate of at least 20 life or death struggles with various deities, plus hundreds of near-death experiences on her own life. Oh, the list seems to keep going. Let's see. Being turned into a frog, having her soul forcibly ripped from her body twice, being chained and dragged into a lifeless void dimension, that one's apparently happened a few times, and of course having the very existence of multiple worlds resting on her shoulders. Overall, that seems like a lot of potentially traumatizing and stressful experiences, so let's see how she's doing right now. Okay, let's call that well-adjusted. Setting that example aside, welcome to Worlds Familiar. I'm Jessie, I'm a sociologist and a gaming nerd myself, and today I wanted to go ahead and mix those particular passions to examine how popular presentations of resilience and grit in video games stack up against how those concepts tend to show up in reality. But to get started, let's go ahead and give a quick answer to the question. Can any person, under any circumstance, go through the more extreme examples of video game style trauma and come out the other side feeling unbothered and skippy? To which, by my measure, no. Pretty far from it, to be perfectly honest. Don't get me wrong, we humans go through a lot over the course of our lives, and we are quite adaptive and perseverant. However, events do affect us. If we were to get physically injured, wounds take time to heal, and that makes sense. If we experience something emotionally traumatizing, recovering from that will also take time and effort. We often carry wounds that are physical, mental, and social. In contrast, video game characters are, to risk stating the obvious, not human. They often display very different expressions of emotion. They might respond to traumatic situations with being stressed or dealing with emotional scars, but that creates a change in narrative that not all stories are trying to build towards. For every story like Wolfenstein with a war is hell narrative with grizzled protagonists stepping forward with revenge and murder being all that is left in their husk of a psyche, there's another one that has cartoonish and colorful characters that are actively tortured on screen, only to have it all fixed with a health potion, a hug from a friend, or literally a warm vitamin bath. But let's not oversimplify the trend. Those examples are the extremes, so what about the rest of the spectrum of experiences and presentations that we see? What tends to be closer to scientifically accurate when we look at research into resilience? Where do games tend to do better or worse? And to note, I'll be examining resilience and not grit. Modern understandings of grit are more in the psychology ballpark and not so much in the sociology ballpark. Resilience and grit are technically different, so I want to go ahead and be honest about it. But that's alright. We have enough to talk about anyway, since people can use the term resilience to refer to a collection of astonishingly different processes, and this inconsistency has been noted and complained about repeatedly by researchers. To go ahead and kick things off, let's give a definition that let's say has been used historically, which is the ability to not change in state or become harmed while under stress. Now, at first blush, this may seem like a pretty reasonable definition. If somebody charges straight into an opposing army and they come out both still being alive and completely unharmed, then we could call them resilient. And yeah, that would be accurate. But this definition becomes deceptive pretty quickly. For instance, does feeling bad or having emotional scars count as being harmed? Is a character leveling up or getting stronger or more skilled count as a change of state? Is adapting to a bad situation a failure to be resilient because you're not able to complete the task in the same state that you started in? So with those counterpoints in mind, this definition is, well, it kind of flies like a brick. Character growth becomes a fail state in this definition, which is not usually how stories work. Now, being perfectly honest, I bring this up as a definition since this interpretation of resilience has been used in the past, and it is technically still in use today. Though now, it would be seen as a definition of engineering resilience, or in other words, what engineers use to figure out if something like a bridge or a building is good or not. If a bridge changes or becomes damaged from a reasonable amount of physical stress, then it's a bad bridge. After all, we don't want a bridge to change or have an emotional crisis while we are walking over it. Now, psychologists and sociologists like myself agree that humans don't make good construction material, though I don't know any engineers to confirm their feelings on the matter. But for us non-engineers, there are a ton of definitions floating around academia that experts do use. I can't give a singular, conclusive definition because, to be honest, there isn't one. Academic research can be muddy like that. Still, to go ahead and give us something to work with, I've gone ahead and stitched together a definition that roughly covers the important bits for understanding resilience in people. This definition would be a group's or individual's capacity to endure and adapt resources to continue to progress in the face of a specific adversity that they view themselves as responsible to address. Pardon the long definition, it's easy to get lost in the nuance, but let's go ahead and break it down since these things are easier to tackle piece by piece. So first, the popular image of a resilient person is one who can endure great struggles with little to no assistance. The more solo, one-person army kind of hero, Leon Kennedy, Bayonetta, the Tarnished of Elden Ring. The list is endless. The kind that spend no more than 3 seconds on a healing animation and never waver in their resolve. And to be honest, this image is great for storytelling, and the protagonist being a person of exceptional superpower has been popular for as long as we've had storytelling. But where the stress of carrying the weight of the world solo is practically a non-factor for many heroes of such stories, it tends to come with more side effects in reality. Stress can hurt someone's ability to focus, and it's pretty common for individuals to come across problems that they cannot easily deal with alone. When it comes down to it, we're social creatures. We tend to work better when we're with friends, family, or other people who share our goals. It may sound basic, but many hands makes the burden lighter. And I don't mean lightens only the burden that is immediately relevant to the story. Honestly, the mundane actually matters more than the dramatic here. In fiction, the dramatic last-minute rescue may be the more common plot device, but in reality, those feelings of being supported, welcomed, and accepted, those are the ones that tend to matter more for a person's mental well-being and tends to help them prepare and build up that feeling of being capable for when adversity does come along. With that in mind, game narratives that focus on a party or a group are typically more accurate on average than either a solo act or whenever the supporting cast is more stage dressing than plot relevant. But when it's clear that the characters do care for and support each other, that'll be more accurate to reality. Maybe less dramatic at times, but I've always been a fan of some good party banter and having allies in the front line and back at base who actually help and care for others in the story. Not even just the main character, but just others in the story. So let's check the definition. Next up is adapt and use resources. That's easy to define, right? Resources are like health kits, spell scrolls, and other one-time used mystical or technological baubles, right? Well, yeah, and it's not really limited to that. Think of any individual game. Now, think of anything that you would have access to in that game. A health bar is pretty common, so are skill trees or other power-increasing mechanics. Those count as resources. How about equipment, knowledge of hiding places, or a deep wallet and the ability to hire mercenaries? Sure, you can scooch those right into the pile. Heck, in many real-time strategy games, humans literally are resources to be moved around and used as needed. A woodcutter can just as easily become a miner or an explorer if the situation requires and allows it. It's not like we humans are just one-trick ponies. We are often great resources for others, and others are resources for us. In the abstract, this is not too far off from how it works in reality, even if the details are pretty substantially different. If you have more money, more relevant skills, or a stronger social network, then you are more likely to be able to deal with struggles and face fewer long-term repercussions from whatever is thrown your way. Now in fiction, this often ends up being undercut a lot for the sake of dramatic narrative. Upsetting the status quo is basically page 1, option 1 on the writing manual of how to get your hero's butt out of the house. We've all seen it happen. An event of the story's design comes up, and the protagonist must go forth, adapting their skills and abilities to survive and resolve the plot. Notably, this would work best if the protagonist already had a number of skills beforehand, though obviously that's hardly a requirement for storytelling standards. But someone with more skill or experience would have more to bring to the table and could be more capable of dealing with a wider variety of situations. Needing to learn skills from scratch and on the fly is harder and substantially more stressful, and a desperate, untrained person is going to be more prone to costly and potentially fatal errors. To compare to an example of disruption that could affect people in real life, let's say a parent is injured and needs to go to the hospital. If this parent needs some kind of major medical care, their children might not have a person actively taking care of them while they're at the hospital. So a friend or an aunt or an uncle can adapt and help by becoming a babysitter for a time, looking after younger children, explaining things, and maybe helping with the various financial and social burdens associated with recovery. In this case, we could say that such a family is adapting their own skills and resources in order to try and lessen the damage and help with the resilience of the injured parent and their children. With those two to compare, the styles of fiction and reality couldn't be much further apart in regards to what is expected. If a traumatic event blows up one's access to resources, then that's a pretty massive problem in reality. But in fiction, it seems to happen every other week. That said, the underlying principle is largely the same. Have more resources, adapt those resources, and use those resources. The more you have, typically the better off you are. Oh, and as a comment, it is important to note that resources do have to actually be used here. Not used as in consumed, as obviously I've already noted that not all resources are consumable, but if you have an ultra powerful healing elixir that you fear you might need for later, and then you never end up using it, well, that may as well have been a scrap of tissue paper for all it mattered. Others have already talked about the but I might need it later tendency that tends to run strong in the habits of many tabletop and classical RPG players, including my own habits. And it's a clear example of how resources can end up not being used. The same principle is still true in reality. If someone has a major problem but refuses to accept help or use any skills or resources, then those resources are not as likely to be used and not as likely to help with resilience. And speaking of the use of resources, it is perhaps a surprise to precisely 0 people and 2 cats that not all resources are useful in all scenarios. And in the same vein, resilience itself is not actually a general trait that someone has. It would be inaccurate to say that anyone is resilient to all potential kinds of problems. This is because resilience is directional. A group or individual is resilient against something. There's frequently a goal that needs to be defined in order for resilience to be understood. Now, in games, these are often quite simple. A common goal may be stop the evil emperor / army / god thing from eating the universe, or some other generalized stop bad person from doing bad thing. In such a case, determining if someone is resilient is based on their ability to continue to work forward towards stopping that entity despite adversity, to be able to endure whatever hallway trash or other problems are thrown their way, and their ability to be able to keep moving forward. Another common goal is simply to survive, and resilience would then be defined by an ability to, well, survive. Surprising, I know. Though we could add additional factors such as being able to stay healthy or happy or build a cool house or guide a community without becoming a total tyrant. Or maybe you're struggling with financial problems, so you take on a job that straps you with a massive debt and you end up beholden to a company that you hate, a company that treats you like your property, yet you try and go from day to day physically isolated from friends and family, trying to whittle away at that mountain of costs and holding out hope that it'll serve some purpose for the rest of the future, or at least the future of your family if yours can't be saved. Company propaganda may say it's easy, just work harder, but you know that their goal is their own bottom line and not really to your benefit. Is that bill still going? What? How? Not even my student loans are that bad. No! Okay, let's set that bit aside. So obviously there are a variety of stressors that people are presented with, and not just in scale and type of stressor, but how much willingness or power people have to face whatever that problem is. Good reflexes and sword skills don't typically help if you want to change how an intergalactic company works or pay off student debts. And a heroic story can quickly spiral into tragedy if the protagonist's resources and abilities don't help with the problem at hand. Adapting and coping is often part of the story, but if that adaptation fails, then major problems are far more likely to happen. The major differences between games, fiction, and reality are primarily the complexity, longevity, and mundaneness, if we're being perfectly honest, of many issues. Trying to make even a small change to an economic system could take lifetimes of effort, and success is far from guaranteed. It's not dramatic, it can be frustrating, and it is often affected by hundreds of distant forces working throughout society. Not all issues even can be escaped. On a more conventional front, a common one for reality is discrimination based on traits such as race, sex, or LGBTQ+ status. There's no simple solution to poverty or discrimination at a societal level, yet they are problems that require resilience from individuals just like any other problem. Now, I do want to eventually make videos that give those topics their due attention. But to suffice for now, and for this topic, research has found that those who identify as LGBTQ+ and have stable social networks and resources tend to be able to cope with discrimination more easily and have fewer long-term repercussions on average than those without such social support. Likewise, many Black parents in the United States teach their children about discrimination ahead of time, preparing their children on what to expect, how to emotionally cope with an experience, and how to lower the risk of danger when risky scenarios do arise. Being prepared for such adversity, whether it be emotional or physical, tends to help dull the edge of such interactions. The adversity is still present, it is still actively a problem, and it is still something to actively combat in our society, but people are not passive vessels. We do prepare for what we expect our groups to face in the future. This preparation can contribute towards improving resilience by helping individuals and groups better understand what may happen, what to do when situations do happen, and feeling that they are not alone and isolated in their experience whenever situations do arise. But to move on, I'd like to take a small tangent to talk about how people view responsibility. Because just because something is a problem doesn't mean that people see themselves as responsible for that problem. This process of assigning responsibility is rarely considered in fiction or even in reality, but some scholars argue that it is pretty vitally important to understanding what we're talking about. So to ask a seemingly obvious question, who is responsible for the villains that run amok in Gotham City? The answer would be Batman, right? I mean, it's obvious. Well, that answer would be both right, but it would also be wrong. It should be the responsibility of the local police force, maybe Commissioner Gordon, maybe the mayor, or other people who are working for the city and who are paid by the city to confront crime and reduce crime rates. But if you were to tell Batman to maybe chill, since it's not his job, he'd probably say something edgy and then go punch a penguin, or the penguin, or other villain of the week. Batman would, in large part, have assigned responsibility of Gotham to himself. And regardless of what anyone else says, he has internalized that responsibility and he acts on that. So how does this influence resilience? Well, if Batman didn't see it as his problem, he wouldn't need resilience to address it. He may not stress over whatever damage happens, and he may be less likely to care or even think it is important enough to change how he goes about his billionaire lifestyle. But on the flip side of the bat coin, it is because he sees it as his responsibility that he is so determined to fix what he sees as his problem to solve. Now, whenever we look at games or really any media, it doesn't matter what the problem is or what battle is being fought, we tend to assume that we're following the person or group that's responsible to resolve the plot of the story. Otherwise it'd be kinda boring, right? It's an artifact of fiction, sure, but it's an understandable one. But let's go ahead and step out of the fiction for now and talk about responsibilization in reality. So let's say someone is poor and they want to be not poor. They're willing to work and able to work, but they can't find a decent job. So whose responsibility is it to fix this particular conundrum? Depending on who you ask, you're likely to get different answers. Some will say that it's the individual's responsibility. They should try harder, pull them up by their bootstraps, or go get an education, or some other fix it yourself, ain't my problem kind of view. This particular view doesn't tend to solve problems at a societal level and can also add to other issues. But moving on. Others would argue that it is the government's responsibility to make sure fair paying jobs are available to anyone and everyone willing to work. Individuals can't really control what jobs are hiring, but it is something we all kind of expect should be available in some fashion to those willing and able to work. But how about the wealthy, or those who own companies? Well, they have an incentive to place the responsibility on the individual. If it were considered the responsibility of the company, it could affect the bottom line. So people who are running or owning the companies have financial incentives to promote narratives that emphasize the responsibility of the poor. After all, if someone is responsible for pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, then it's not on the company's bill. But back to circling around to Batman, and again noting that he sees himself as responsible and that is purely an artifact of fiction, but if it were a real scenario, and following real world logic, he is basically acting as an unpaid employee solving expensive problems. He pays in time, effort, and money, while those who run the city, or the police force at least, don't have to do as much to fix the problems he's involved in. He is responsible in practice, but he shouldn't be responsible in principle. Batman is enduring more and needing to face more adversity, But the city, at least in theory, is not having to face as much adversity or as many burdens because they can rely on his contribution. So to summarize, the foolproof, can endure anything levels of resilience that we see in fiction, those simply don't exist in reality. Resilience isn't some kind of inherent trait, it's not consistent, and it's laid in with context. But there are some things that contribute to resilience in more general ways. First, Lord of the Rings style groups tend to do better than die-hard solo acts. Emotional support networks and having help to find that spark of hope in the darkness matters. Second, resources are important. Skills are resources, people are resources. Typically, the more resources you have access to and the more that you can use, the better prepared you can be for various crises. Third, resource is directional. A person or group is resilient against a kind of problem. Not all resources or skills work against all kind of problems. And lastly, responsibility is important for context and can be batted around in different directions by society. If Group Alpha says Group Delta is responsible, that can be important for context. If Group Delta also sees themselves as responsible, then that can change how they exert effort or take on stressors to endure or fix whatever problem is present. Now, with these in mind, I want to bring attention to one game that both has a fantasy level disaster and kept a narrative that is remarkably close to what would typically build up resilience in real life. So let's take a look at Children of Morta. If you haven't heard of this game, that's probably pretty normal. It's a small indie title and a decent roguelite for those who are into the genre. But what I want to talk about is how the family displays resilience. In the game, you're not some lone hero. You play as the Bergsons, by which you mean the entire family. A father, 2 daughters, 2 sons, and some extended family are all playable in dungeons, while the mother, grandmother, and uncle are medics, enchanters, and a blacksmith. They have a relatively secure home, high-quality weapons, tools, and years of training. And they all see the ancient evil styled adversary as unjust and a problem that they are collectively responsible for dealing with. Meanwhile, emphasis is repeatedly placed on how they help each other deal with the emotional burden, contributing to feelings of stability, mutual support, and positive emotions such as hope. It's clear that their history as a family has been a stable and mutually supportive one. Honestly, it checks just about every box on the real-world list of what would contribute to resilience in such a situation. Almost too well, if I'm being perfectly blunt. If I had a critique, it would be that those who typically face the most adversity are rarely the same people that have such a bountiful and secure amount of resources and support. Those who are wealthy or powerful are not often the boots on the ground, while those who lack resources are typically more likely to be the same groups that face adversity. That said, that debate is largely swapping out one fiction for another. Children of Morta gets closer to scientifically accurate depictions of what promotes resilience, but fiction is still fiction. And let's be honest, if games or movies were completely accurate, they would probably carry significantly heavier moods and have fewer moments for fun once the in-universe shenanigans started happening. But that said, that's going to be it for this topic. But before you go, this is obviously my first video for this channel. If you've enjoyed it, maybe help me out by doing the whole support YouTube content thing. Like, subscribe, tell me what characters in fiction you found to be great or awful at representing resilience. I'd appreciate it, and it would give me more reason to make more of these videos. But beyond that, take it easy, and I hope you all have a good one.